Hi there, and welcome to the Isms and Schisms Podcast. This podcast normally takes some weird or obscure theological idea or moment in church history and unpacks it, and I give my perspective on it. I think theology is really important. It's not about the doctrines or the conclusions themselves per se, but about the questioning and the exploring. Well, this episode is a little bit different. It's not really an ism or a schism, but it's an interview. An interview? That's right. You're going to hear the voice of another human person that's not me. And we're talking about leadership. I think theology is important and something everyone should do. But I also think that leadership is something that everyone can do and that everyone can become better leaders. If you're a parent, you're a leader. If you're a teacher, you're a leader. If you own a business or coach a footy team or run a collective of painters who only use paints that you make yourself from naturally formed pigments in the soil, you're a leader. I don't know what you're doing, but I genuinely believe that everyone, you can be a leader, and that aspiring to leadership is a really good thing, a Christ-like thing. Leadership doesn't have to be big. It could be small. But it's about making a difference, having a positive impact on the world. So I think you'll really enjoy this episode. There's some theology in it, some church history in it, and so much wisdom. The sort of episode you'll probably need to listen to 2 or 3 times because the person I'm talking to really knows his stuff. Before we get into it, I just want to mention the Isms and Schisms Facebook group. I've recently created a group where people can chat and share their thoughts, either what they thought of the podcast or of anything theology or history or whatever you like, really. It's a pretty easy way to build up a community, which I think would be cool. So jump onto Facebook, search for the Isms and Schisms group, and join. I want to meet you and hear what you think. So today's guest is an accomplished theologian and lecturer, was the principal of a theological college for 17 years, which really took off with him at the helm, has been a pastor and a preacher for most of his life, sat on and chaired boards of large national organization. He gets asked to teach all over the world in the disciplines of theology, apologetics, preaching, and leadership. He's published multiple books, was pepper sprayed while protesting apartheid in South Africa. He's a chess champion and a co-founder of Avenir Leadership Institute. And he just so happens to be my father-in-law. Get ready to learn some knowledge in this conversation with Dr. Brian Harris. Hi, Brian. Thank you for joining me in this discussion on the Isms and Schisms podcast.
Hi, Aaron, and good to be with you.
And this is actually the very first interview of this podcast.
Do I make history? That's really good. Great.
It's a momentous occasion.
It is indeed.
So thank you for joining me. And I hear that you are an avid listener of the Isms and Schisms podcast.
I am. I don't think I've missed any of them so far. So that's a great credit to you.
Oh, nice. Well, thank you. And do you have a favorite episode?
I have favorites, so I love the ones that dip into history. We've been doing a little bit in the Reformation relatively recently on quite sobering some of the things you said about Luther and on Calvin and the others. So enjoyed those. The one on Christmas was fascinating, of course, kind of kicking around dates.
It's just me popping in here to say that you can go back and find the episodes I did on the Reformation and the Christmas specials from late last year. I reckon they're pretty good too.
That's a great show.
You've got another position in terms of my life. Brian, you are my father-in-law. I'm not sure why I felt the need to remind him of this.
I have a wonderful daughter that you're married to.
Yeah, she is wonderful. But just talking about you, who are you? Why should our listeners listen to you?
Well, I mean, that's up to them at the end of the day. But I'm Brian Harris. I've served as principal of a theological college for 17 years. I have led in a number of different settings, and I think we are looking at leadership today and some of the isms that could go along with that. So that's been my context. I've chaired a number of boards, and I think quite a bit in terms of the realm of leadership, because I head up the Avenir Leadership Institute, and we try to train leaders for a better world, and we encourage people to think of the world that we could see, and then to ask the question, so what kinds of leaders do we need? So it's a space that I'm working in the whole time, and I get the privilege to both coach a number of very significant leaders, to work alongside them, and to work with some great organizations.
He's definitely being humble. There are lots of reasons to listen to Brian talk about leadership.
You were the principal when I started in my studies.
Yes, so if you haven't turned out well, then it's all my fault, I'm sure.
So you yourself are a theologian.
Correct.
You looked at, was it Stanley Grenz?
Yeah, he did a PhD in his view on evangelicalism and his attempt to devise a model to revision it so that it was more relevant for the 21st century. Thought he came up with some great ideas, and I proposed some revisions of Grenz's revisions. So, so there you go. That's what my doctoral work was in.
So Stanley Grenz was an American theologian whose work was in a whole lot of areas: theology, ethics, history, analyzing evangelicalism and postmodernism. He published the first systematic theology textbook that I ever read and enjoyed, and was supervised by the German theologian who has always fascinated me, Wolfhart Pannenberg. Really smart guy, very academic, but tragically died in 2005 from a brain aneurysm, aged only 55.
And then you moved into pastoral work as well as lecturing, and coming from South Africa.
Yes, so the accent is both South African and then modified a little bit in a number of years in New Zealand. So people sometimes say, you sound like a Kiwi, and other times they say, you sound like a South African. And when I'm in the US, people say you sound just like an Australian. So I'm not sure who's right.
Who knows? And now you're over here in sunny Perth.
I am indeed.
For a while.
Yeah.
And so you've really thought into this area of leadership, and you've written quite a lot about this topic of leadership, haven't you?
Yeah, well, 2 key books in it. So I've written 7 books, but the 2 on leadership. The first one was The Tortoise Usually Wins, which looks at quiet leadership. In other words, leadership for people who are reluctant leaders, don't necessarily see themselves in that space. And then much more recently, you've just put out a book, Stirrers and Saints, which looks at spiritual formation for leadership and the importance of leaders being well-formed spiritually, because leadership gives so many responsibilities, so much power, so many opportunities to do good, but also so many opportunities to do harm.
Yeah, we'll return to Stirrers and Saints and dive into that a little bit. But this topic of leadership, why? Why is it important to you?
Oh, because leaders make a difference. I mean, I think if you look at your life and you it's the Mary Oliver question, isn't it? Tell me, what will you do with your one wild and glorious life? Well, I can't quite remember how she puts the question, but it is this probing question. Tell me, what is it that you're planning to do with this one precious, wild and precious life, I think she calls it. What is it that you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? And you do think into the leadership space then, because you think my life can make a difference in some ways. And leaders do make a difference. And I think leaders are people who care about situations, and they look at them and they say, oh my goodness, that isn't a very life-serving place for some people. How could we open this up? How could there be better outcomes? How could people flourish that much more? And you start to realize that it's not necessarily a mystical thing. It's about taking certain steps to make sure that everyone finds a voice, everyone finds their place, everyone can become a little bit more of who they are. And when you realize I could make a difference in that way, then you think, maybe that's what I can do with my one wild and precious life.
Can everyone make a difference?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I do believe that. I think we tend to think, often we think in the leadership space in terms of what could be called charismatic views of leadership or heroic views of leadership, where we think of the great person and they are just larger than life and they change everything altogether.
And I think we can all kind of picture that sort of leader in our head when we think of the big, loud, charismatic sort of type.
Absolutely. And in the political realm, they are sometimes popular, sometimes they fail very spectacularly, but they get noticed. So it's leadership as the person you notice. And then many people think, no, I can't do that. And that's actually why I wrote the first book. I wrote The Tortoise Usually Wins, because I was convinced that there were a lot of quiet leaders who could make a real difference if they realized that it was leadership that they were involved in. So leadership you could view as being a task. You do certain things. You have a vision. You see where something could go to. You break that down. You think through what steps need to be taken to actually be able to achieve this. So it's not a mystical thing. It's something that you do fairly systematically, and it's about resilience and tenacity and turning up. And it's about building a network of relationships to make that possible, because we shouldn't think just about leadership as singular, but we should think of leaderships. And the moment we think of leaderships as a plural concept, then I think we think actually there is space for a whole lot of people here. And leadership tends to become toxic when we think of it in the singular, the great person, and it's all about them. Like, there's very little life that comes from that. When it's leaderships, it's us together. We know where we're wanting to go, and we work together really well, and we take steps to build the better world that we seek is possible. That's leadership, and leadership's at its best.
See, I told you he knows a lot about leadership. It might be worth going back and listening to that section again. A whole lot of knowledge got dropped just then.
So leadership is about seeing the possibilities of a better future and making a plan to get there?
Yeah. And it's about realizing that there are different things you might have to do to achieve that. So I've called my most recent book Stirrers and Saints, because I alliterate a little bit and use 7 S words that describe what leaders do. And those words, the first of them is...
Wait, are we allowed to say the 7... Are we allowed to say S words on this?
Oh, well, it's your podcast. You tell me whether we're allowed to say S words or not.
You tell me whether I'll need the explicit warning next to that.
I don't think so. So it's stirrers.
Okay.
So I think that's okay. Yeah. Breath of relief. And stirring is about actually, stirring things up, actually saying the status quo doesn't have to be forever. Let's change. So it's about the leader as a change agent. Leaders need to be saints, and I have become more and more convinced about that, whether you are in a religious context or a purely kind of commercial world, you still need to be a saint in the sense of being a good person. And I recognize that in the commercial world, they would feel that that's forcing the alliteration a little bit to call it a saint, but this is essentially a religious podcast, so maybe it works in this context. So we got away with saints here. Leaders, I think, need to be servants, and they need to be shepherds, and they need to be stewards, and they need to be seers, and they need to be sages. And since I've written that book, you have given me this great idea, Aaron, that I should have added an 8th, and that is that leaders should be sculptors, so builders of a new reality. I think that fits in with the stirrers, but it gives it a lovely little new twist as well.
You're welcome.
Thank you. I'll pay you some of the royalties. You can get it in my will one day.
I'm sure there'll be lots of royalties.
Oh, huge.
So again, those S words are stirrer, saint, servant, shepherd, seer, sage, steward, and sculptor.
You said your first book was The Tortoise Usually Wins. And so that's playing on the story of the tortoise and the hare, right? But you do kind of think that the hare would usually win. Is that right?
Well, the hare could, but there's no question about it. In terms of actual ability in the story, the hare has the capacity to go kind of racing down that track and getting there first. But the hare just isn't motivated, and the hare isn't focused, and the hare would like a nap, and the hare, all these other things that come in, and the hare's super confident, and the hare's never really been challenged, whereas the tortoise just step by step by step by step goes there, and in the fable crosses the line first. Why? Because the tortoise knew where she or he was going.
So that persistent, tenacious...
Yeah, and resilient as well, like not giving up. So for in the story of the hare and the tortoise, the hare gets a little bit tired, so let's have a little nap here. Whereas the tortoise, who knows, maybe the tortoise was tired as well. But the tortoise knew, I don't have time for this, I need to just break through that barrier and I'll get to that line, and does.
So there's that awareness of direction
and purpose.
And purpose.
Yeah, I think having a real sense of purpose, having motivation for that. And let's remember, there's no motivation fairy out there. We sometimes say, if only I could get motivated. We actually get motivated through doing. It's much the same as when you go to the gym. Like, if you go to the gym, very few people go there thinking, yo, I'm going to the gym, really looking forward to this. But you leave feeling, I'm so glad I went. Yeah. Actually, as you do it, that motivation starts to rise. So purpose, like I know where I'd like to go. And then motivation, no, there's no motivation fairy. I need to actually get into this and I will become motivated then as I do it. And direction. I think that those are the three key things: purpose, motivation, direction. I know where I'm heading and I do that consistently. I don't change direction every 3 minutes.
There's a very stoic aspect to this, having absolute conviction about what you need to do and just getting on with it. Tenacity and discipline will get you where you need. Listen to my episode on Stoicism. Do it. Also, sometimes having a nap can be really good. If you need to have a nap, have a guilt-free nap. But don't be like the hare and lose track of time.
Some people might think that they themselves are the hare. Mm-hmm. Should they turn themselves into turtles?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So there's nothing wrong with being a charismatic leader. And in both the books, both Taurus Usually Wins and Stirrers and Saints, I do try to make this point. There are many gifts that charismatic leaders very naturally have. And it's much easier to get a following if you are a charismatic leader. And that can be really very helpful. So no, I'm not trying to run down charismatic leaders, but as with any form of leadership, there are particular temptations and there's the shadow side. I think the shadow side of charismatic leadership is that it can become all about you. It can very easily become narcissistic leadership. And you can start to just rest on your natural abilities without actually really carefully doing your research. You know, when you have the ability to kind of stand up and sway a room very easily because you have natural empathy or you communicate with people really well, that's an extraordinary gift. The trouble is, it often works just as well whether you're right or whether you're wrong. And that's often the problem with charismatic leaders. They haven't done the background work. They managed to persuade people, but the work they've done has been quite shallow. And so they are turning people to a cause that just disintegrates. And you can think of, like, I don't like to name people in podcasts, but just think through some political leaders and think of the way they've done things. And they actually persuade masses, and it's drivel that they're actually talking about. Yeah. And when you analyze it, it's just drivel, but it's very persuasive drivel because of the charisma. That's the shadow side of it.
Mm. So the work that you've done, talking about quiet leaders, it's a really valuable, really helpful correction to the overemphasis on the leader as that big charismatic sort of person.
Yep.
So that could be really, really helpful, I think. But in terms of theology, because this is a theology, church history podcast.
Great.
What is the role of leadership within theology, within the Christian worldview or the Christian way of doing life?
Yeah, so I think it's good to do theology with a Christological focus. So I think Jesus really matters. And
Jesus really matters. That's
there you go. Use that as your slogan. And therefore we should listen to what he says. And when he speaks about leadership, Matthew 20, he's talking about how the Gentiles lord it over you. And then he's just got this wonderful little phrase, Matthew 20:26, I think it is, not so with you. Those extraordinarily important four words, not so with you. So you've seen certain models of leadership that are all about the leader, kind of lording it over you and making sure that you do whatever it is that they want for their benefit. Not so with you. And he goes on, he unpacks the concept of servant leadership. Like if you want to be first, be willing to be last. The leader is the one who actually gets their hands dirty. It isn't all about them. It's about the good of the group. It's about what other people become, not about who the leader becomes. Those are the things that make it distinctly Christian in its focus. It's the other-centeredness of it. And it's the willingness to be a servant on behalf of others.
So service and incarnation.
Yeah, and actually being there. I mean, it's a remarkable thing about Jesus' leadership. Jesus is God. Does he really need to come to this planet? Or are there things that he didn't know without coming? Well, I don't know, but he chose to come. And in doing that, he's modeling something. It's leadership that is alongside. And incarnational leadership, where you actually have a feel for what it's like to be out there in the trenches, really, really important.
Any other leadership principles that we can draw from the life of Jesus?
Yeah, so I think the model of crucifixion, resurrection can be a really helpful one. So it's Friday, and often in leadership it feels like it's Friday. No, I don't want to. I recognize that can almost sound offensive, as though the difficulties we have in some way compared to the difficulties of the cross. No, I'm not meaning it like that, but I am just very loosely speaking that there is a sense in which to achieve really worthwhile things, you do often go through times of extraordinary difficulty. And then there is another day that dawns. So it might be Friday, but Sunday's coming. And it's the resilience that you need to go through there. I think that if you look at the stories in the Bible, there are extraordinarily important leadership principles or things that we learn about people that we need to remember in leadership. So again, if you think through the cross, who was there? The people who were there where was Simon Peter? You know, he couldn't be seen for dust. Well, he was there. He was loosely there, but he was denying Jesus. He needs another chance. And very often in leadership, we do need to recognize we shouldn't be too quick to write people off. People who might fail quite dismally, but if they can be reframed, restarted, like there is another chance for them. Simon Peter does go on to be he becomes the first leader of the early church. But also there at the cross of the women who stand close to the cross of Jesus. They're often the quiet leaders, aren't they? The ones who are actually there at the time of greatest difficulty. And they don't get a huge amount of coverage in the story other than that they're there. But then they are entrusted with being amongst the first witnesses to the resurrection. So I think it's that inclusive leadership story. Like, who does Jesus entrust the message to? Pretty ordinary people. And who, like that very first message about resurrection, entrusted to women whose testimony would not have been considered able to be heard in court.
In the ancient world, women were generally pretty far down the ranks in terms of social hierarchy. It was a thoroughly patriarchal world where women usually were not the ones to make decisions. They could boss slaves around and women of lower social standing, but they had no formal place in society at large. Now, of course, we know that women are actually pretty smart, and many of them did find ways to exert their influence in subtle ways. Livia Drusilla, the wife of Caesar Augustus, is a good example of this. So there are some exceptions. Generally speaking, women weren't trusted to give accurate testimony. There are some exceptions to this, and there are records of women giving testimony, but not many. And it was very strict in the Jewish tradition. It was forbidden in Jewish law, which does make it all the more surprising that in the gospel narratives, it's women who are the first witnesses to Jesus' resurrection. In literary studies, when determining if something is historically accurate, historians might use what is called the criterion of embarrassment, which basically means that if something happens in a piece of literature that would probably have been embarrassing for the author who wrote that piece of literature, then it's more likely to be historically accurate. Because if it's just all made up, the author would probably have written it in a way that was just a little bit more flattering. So the fact that women play such an important part in the Gospels and the early church and the resurrection narrative is rather telling, because it would have been embarrassing at the time to have women testify to this miracle rather than men.
So it's a very inclusive view of leadership. It's a way that empowers ordinary people.
On the topic of looking back and seeing leadership principles that we can draw from these historical characters, are there any others through history that you see as a good leadership model?
Yeah, Well, I mean, there are just so many. There have been 2,000 years of church history. Extraordinary, and there have been wonderful examples, and there have been very disappointing ones. Yeah. But one of the characters that really fascinates me, perhaps because he doesn't get terribly much coverage, though I think you did cover him in one of your podcasts, if I remember correctly, Alcuin of York.
I did indeed. One of the earliest episodes was on Alcuin of York, a man who stood up to Charlemagne and was a leader of the Carolingian Renaissance, which saw great improvement in literacy and art and general well-being throughout the Holy Roman Empire.
And so he's born in roughly 635. We don't know necessarily the exact year, but it was around about there. Does I think 704. So it's the Middle Ages, and he's just this most remarkable human being. People often think that he was a monk. He wasn't. He never actually formally became a monk. He stays as a deacon forever. And when you look at what he achieved in his lifetime, this man was extraordinary. He was involved in just about everything. I come from a Baptist background, and we always say the Baptists are the pioneers of religious liberty. No, not true. Alcuin got there first. He manages to persuade Charlemagne, because at that time, Alcuin spends the first half of his life, or most of his life, in York, but then actually goes over to France and becomes confidant to the emperor, Charlemagne. And at that time, Charlemagne was involved in kind of converting everyone, but at the point of the sword. So if you were a pagan, you basically had the choice: become a Christian or be dead. And Alcuin kind of goes in and he persuades Charlemagne that that's not the appropriate thing to do. And so I think it was in, 697 that Charlemagne actually agrees that no longer will people be executed for not being Christians. And thank you, Alcuin, like he was the man who changed the emperor's mind.
That's no small feat.
It's no small feat, and it's hugely significant. I mean, it's not always remembered, so it gets forgotten about as the Crusades come on, and that's a leadership lesson. While we would love to think that our legacy lasts forever, a couple of hundred years later, they're making exactly the same errors. But that he was a pioneer of religious freedom, absolutely an extraordinary man. And yet, that's not all, because, of course, he's involved in the Carolingian Renaissance, and they revised the alphabet and how we write. And so he's a key leader in that as well. And if people don't know what was done there, can you imagine reading a sentence that has no gap between the words? Everything is in capital letters, and there are no question marks, there are no commas, there are no full stops. I mean, just try and do that and see how difficult it is to actually read. And Alcuin is part of this Renaissance movement that actually introduces punctuation and question marks and things like that. And because of that, reading becomes much more accessible. So it's the democratizing of, you don't have to be super, super smart to be able to read anymore. With the aid of punctuation, it becomes so much more accessible for ordinary people. So he's, and as an educator, he's just extraordinary. He devises all these little riddles and puzzles for his students, and he also introduces, I don't know what word to use for it, but it's kind of friendly banter in the classroom. So in an era where everyone seemed to be so serious and discipline was draconian, he has all these affectionate names for all the students in the class, and they're often based on puns and all kinds of things. And it's you just sense this warmly curious, affectionate group of people committed to learning, and it changes things. We often talk about that period as the Dark Ages, completely misleading, because there were wonderful exceptions doing remarkable things. And he was one of them, living at a difficult time, to be sure, but just living in a different way and leaving a legacy that benefited so many people. But he was never in the first seat. And I think that's why I love him, because in terms of kind of quiet leadership, he is that leader from the second chair, the person who builds relationships, and then from building relationships uses the influence of those relationships give to him to work them for good. So with the Charlemagne, able to actually just say, you don't have to do that. You don't have to be killing these people. There are other ways. There are better ways. And Charlemagne, really? Never thought of that. Okay, well, maybe I could actually put forward this change in law and we can stop killing people like that. I mean, it's possible to do those things when you're just quietly leading at the side.
Yeah, he's an absolutely fascinating character. Really, really important. And I think a lot of his legacy actually kind of got absorbed into Charlemagne's because this big mythology emerged around Charlemagne as the great general, architect, artist, poet, theologian. Everything was thrown onto Charlemagne, and acumen kind of got a little bit lost there, which is really unfortunate.
Well, is it? I mean, he probably wouldn't have minded. So,
that's true.
I mean,
he doesn't mind now.
He doesn't mind now. Like, who is Charlemagne without Alcuin? I think that's a very good question, and the answer is a much lesser person, a much lesser emperor. And isn't that what leaderships is about? Like together we become greater. And when you are involved in Christian leadership, because we do go back to that the whole time, when you don't worry about who lands up getting the most credit, the most astonishing things can actually be achieved. And isn't that an example of that? And he isn't actually totally forgotten about. We're talking about him right now. But no, he's not the one in the limelight. Charlemagne gets credited for a lot of things that actually are more Alcuin's achievement.
Are there historical figures?
Oh, some are much more mixed, aren't they? So when I talk of Alcuin, then that's very positive and so on. But I'm part of the Carey group, and it's a wonderful group doing extraordinarily good work in the world in education in a number of different fields, and Avenir Leadership is a part of that as well. But our founder, the founder of who we named, William Carey, astonishing leader, but there is a bit of a shadow side with him, isn't there?
William Carey was a British Baptist missionary who is often called the father of modern missions. He went to India, where he translated at least parts of the Bible into at least a dozen languages, as well as a lot of Indian literature into English. He founded a university, established an agricultural society, played a prominent role in ending the practice of sati, where a widow would join her dead husband upon his funeral pyre, and a whole lot of other really good things. The nation of India itself acknowledges him as a really significant person. The high school that I went to was named after William Carey. And at the time, the school's motto was one of William Carey's famous quotes. And it's just burned into my memory. I'll never forget it. And it's actually not a bad quote. It's kind of cool. Attempt great things for God. Expect great things from God. But as Brian says here, there is a bit of a shadow side to Carey. The person, that is, not the school.
It's a shadow side of a really unfortunate personal life and a very unhappy marriage. Or his first marriage, he's married 3 times. His first wife dies, but she dies completely overcome by mental illness. Some of that, just the stress and the strain of the drivenness behind Carey that, sees her move to the other move to India, a move that she was in no way ready for, and then not having time for her to help her to integrate into the society. His own home life just disintegrates in ever so many ways. So there are figures who achieve great things, and Carey was a great man and he did some astonishing things. But they also come back to us and they say, if you're a leader, think through who's been sacrificed on the altar of your achievements. And sometimes you might say those sacrifices are okay. They're probably not okay if they're about other people. It's okay if you make them for yourself. If other people are being drawn in and being sacrificed on the altar of good things, I'm not sure that you can always justify that.
Thinking about family and leadership. So I've been a father myself for 3 years now.
3 years, but a wonderful grandson. Well, I have a wonderful grandson. I've got wonderful granddaughters as well, but from you, a grandson.
And so I've been thinking about the parent as a leader as well. And the parent as a leader, that's a very thankless sort of job. But am I right in saying that a parent is a leader?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you lead first in your own home and in one way or another. And when I say you, I don't mean the father or the wife or whatever. I think altogether there are leaderships that operate in the home. And could I say leadership operates actually at every level? I mean, I guess when you got, and you do realize that, because whether you think your 3-year-old is leading you or not, in ever so many ways, he is the leader in your whole home. Like, he sets what can or can't happen.
That's very true. Our whole life is oriented around making sure that he is happy.
He is happy. There you go. So who is actually leading your home? Well, it's the interaction of everyone, isn't it?
Including the cat.
Including the cat, that's right. You do have a cat, and a very fascinating cat, I must say. It always chooses the seat that I want to sit on, but at any rate.
That's what he does.
Yeah.
When I started this podcast, I honestly did not think my cat would get a mention. Shout out to Chester.
But when we recognize that everyone matters, and that, within that network of the home, like, people either develop a deep sense of security, I'm loved, I belong, and therefore I can try, and therefore I'll lean into life. Or people often come away devastated, feeling life has nothing good, not sure who I am. Now, to be true, if you actually study leadership, as a discipline, you'll find that many people who achieved extraordinary things did not come from particularly happy homes. And often it was that vacuum, that sense of vacuum from the home, that drove people on to look for something else and drove them to dig deeply within themselves. And it is one of the truly astonishing things in life that two people faced with relatively similar circumstances go in very different directions in the end. So the one person, will be completely devastated and will opt out of life. The other person will enter into life so much more fully, like, I'm not going to let this get me down. And I think for everyone, it is the recognition that life is an invitation to us. Life asks us a question. What will you do with this one wild and glorious life? What will you do with it? And you can be bitter about what your home didn't give you, or you might be thankful for it, or whatever. But in the end, you must answer the question. Your parents can't answer it for you. And if they do, he's not going to achieve anything because, that's to give too much away.
Because I think as parents, we are shaping the next generation very significantly, and they will copy what we do. My son copies what I do, and it's a little bit scary sometimes.
And at this stage, as a 3-year-old, he copies it thinking that you're always right. As a 13, 14, 15-year-old, he will watch what you do and he will tell you why you're wrong. And at a later stage, you will come to a more measured view between those two. And at all stages, you are being an example. Like, you've been viewed at uncritically, then you're viewed more critically, then you may be viewed a little bit more objectively at a later stage. And all a gift, and it's all part of formation to be the people that we actually are.
Do you think everyone who is a leader can be a better leader?
Oh, definitely. No question about that. I think we become better when we are willing to sit down, when we're willing to reflect back on what we've done, when we're willing to ask the question, how could this be better? I think a growth mindset is absolutely critical in leadership. What is it that we sometimes say, if you're not a freak of nature, you must be a freak of nurture. And I think that's worth thinking about. So I think if you've got a growth mindset, you recognize you don't always have everything just naturally. You've got to work at some things. You've got to work quite hard at them sometimes. And when you recognize that's normal and you have a growth mindset, then you will grow. Then your leadership will improve. If you're just like, that didn't go right the first time. I'm obviously not naturally gifted. I should give up. You're not going to achieve anything then.
Yeah. Would you say that a good way to get better at being a leader would be to buy your book, Stirrers and Saints?
That's the most crucial ingredient of doing it. No, but I do think, I'm just joking obviously there, but not that much of a joke. Like, it is a good thing to do, because actually the point I'm wanting to make is do think about leadership. So many people are not the leaders that they could be because they have not taken the time to think what's involved in leadership. And when you sit down and you realize, hey, it's about planning systematically. It's about actually having a sense of direction. It is about direction. It is about motivation. It is about purpose, like, why are we doing these things? And when I break those things down, and then I think in terms of others, who can we get to be part of this journey together? And what could we do together? So much becomes possible. And maybe when we don't think so much about changing the world, but changing some tangible things that are attainable within our orbit. And what's attainable? Well, remember, we will always overestimate what we can achieve in a year and significantly underestimate what we can achieve in a decade. So think decade long, and you will be able to achieve much more than you might imagine, but that is dependent upon your direction, consistency of direction, motivation, and the purpose that you set for that.
I think that's really, really relevant, helpful advice for everybody listening who aspires to leadership.
Yeah.
Aside from buying and reading your book, you can also, this is a plug for another podcast.
There you go.
You can also listen to the podcast that we are a part of, which is called the Stirrers and Saints Podcast. And I've had a lot of fun talking to you and the team on issues of leadership. So if other people are listening to this and would like more of Brian, they can listen to the Stirrers and Saints podcast.
Well, just as we are a fan of the Isms and Schisms podcast, I'm glad you're a fan of the Stirrers and Saints podcast.
Oh, absolutely.
And you're a contributor to it, so a very important contributor to it.
So thank you for this chat, Brian. I think
Thanks,
there's lots of nuggets of gold in there. It'll be fun to edit.
So long as you don't edit everything out, I'll be interested to see what has been edited out.
Is there any final word you would like to add?
Yeah, step up to leadership. Lean into life. I mean, always say yes to life. I think that the posture with which we approach life is extraordinarily important. And approach life with a posture of openness. Many people have had very difficult things happen to them, and they back out of life because of that. I would really encourage people to say, don't deny the pain that you might have had in your life's journey, but don't let that be the last word. Embrace life, step into it, and ask yourself, how can I be a leader? How can I make a difference?
Well, thank you, Brian.
Thanks, Aaron.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. Really, really good stuff there. Leaders make a difference. They have a vision and they resolutely pave the way to a better future. And everyone can make a positive difference. Everyone can be a leader. Yes, you, dear listener. You may not think it, or maybe you do, but you can be a leader. Say yes to life. Embrace it. Step up. The church and the world needs good leaders. They need you. What will you do with your one wild and precious life? So Brian's book, Stirrers and Saints, is well worth a read. It's not a difficult read, but the leadership lessons in the pages are huge. That book is available from the 14th of June 2024. Go have a read. And also have a listen to the Stirrers and Saints podcast, which both Brian and I are a part of. I've had a lot of fun being involved in that. I do want to finish by saying that I genuinely, truly believe that everyone can be a leader. Everyone can make a positive difference in the world. So go and be that difference. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, step up, say yes, get it done. As I mentioned at the start of this episode, I've created a Facebook group for the Isms and Schisms podcast, a place where we can chat, share ideas and thoughts, what isms you'd like covered on the pod, give me some feedback, and so on. Go check it out. It's the Isms and Schisms group on Facebook. I know Facebook is kind of old school, but it still works for some good chats. But I've got 2 Stirrers and Saints books, autographed by Brian Harris himself, which I will personally send to 2 people, 1 book each, who goes and joins that group. Pretty easy, and you might get a free book. Get on it. So go to the Isms and Schisms group on Facebook. Join, and I might send you a free autographed book. Not a bad deal. Also, remember to rate and follow the podcast. Simply following the podcast really helps support it to keep going. This episode was recorded on the traditional lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people. I look forward to exploring more isms and schisms with you.